one-stop shopping for health information, and they're going to continue to have great information on COVID as well. Okay, I want to go ahead and move right now to our presenter, and I'm so excited that she's here with us. And let me go ahead and do an introduction. I'm going to stop my video there. Dr. Lisa Marici is a associate professor at the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Tulane University. And she is a tenured associate professor in the department. Her research program focuses on the development of next generation vaccines for biodefense and emerging or re-emerging infectious diseases. Dr. Marici has successfully moved candidate vaccines from the discovery stage to planned phase 1 clinical trials. Her vaccine research program is currently supported by the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. And I can tell you that Lisa has been working nonstop since this started to not only do this research, but also educate others. So she's done a lot of town halls, and she's here to speak to you about the vaccine itself. I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic and turn it over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for the generous introduction. And thanks to all of the participants for joining today. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to talk about vaccines to the community. I know there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of fear. And so, hopefully today I can share my thoughts with you, share some of the science and some of the evidence for these vaccines, maybe explain them a little bit easier than what we've heard on the news. And then, we'll open it up for your questions, and you can ask me some of the things that you might have heard or are concerned about. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. See if you guys, let's see. Share screen. Here we go. Let's see. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see that okay.
Yep, you're good to go.
All right, excellent. So, when we think about vaccines, most of us are familiar with traditional vaccines. And when we talk about traditional vaccines, the vaccines that we're all used to, that we received as kids, that we receive annually, like the flu vaccine, what we're talking about there are what we refer to as one drug for one bug. So if you can take flu virus as an example, and you imagine that we want to vaccinate and protect the population from flu, what we've traditionally done is we take the organism itself, the flu virus itself, and we grow it into very large batches. And then we inactivate that virus so that it's somewhat, viruses aren't really alive, but we refer to them as inactivated so that they're harmless, they can't cause disease. And then we take those big batches of inactivated virus and we put them into vials, and then we inject them into our arm as what's known as an inactivated virus vaccine. And flu, that we get every year is an example of that type of technology. And then the other one that we're really used to is similar, where you take the virus of interest, for example, and you grow it up in very large batches, and then you weaken it so that it can't cause disease in our bodies. And there are various ways that we can weaken viruses. We can do it chemically, we can do it genetically. And basically, the weakened virus can then induce a really robust immune response in our bodies, but it can't cause disease in healthy individuals. And so an example of that type of technology is the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that we've all, received as children and vaccinate our children with. And so these are what we're used to. This is what the public has experienced for decades. But as you guys are aware, we've got new technologies now. And I think the new technologies are somewhat misunderstood. And so I thought I might break it down for you. What are these technologies and how do they actually work? So let's start with the messenger RNA vaccines, which are the platforms that Pfizer and Moderna both use. And those are the ones that are currently authorized for use here in the United States. And so basically what we're doing here is we're taking messenger RNA as the platform. So what is messenger RNA? Our bodies use messenger RNA to tell our cells how to make proteins. And so they relay the information encoded on our DNA, and then they take that information, that's why they're called messenger, they message that information to our protein factories in our cells to tell our cells how to make proteins. So messenger RNA, at any point in time in our body, we have hundreds of thousands of copies of messenger RNA in our own cells. So what scientists and engineers have figured out, we can synthesize this messenger RNA in the laboratory, and we can plug into that messenger RNA the genetic information for any virus protein of interest. So in the case of the COVID vaccines, that viral protein of interest is what's known as the spike protein. I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about the spike protein. The spike protein is what decorates the surface of the virus, and it's what it uses to attach to our host cells and invade our body. And so the thought is that if we can induce an immune response to the spike protein, we can block that virus from invading our host cells. And the immune system can also see it very well because, again, it decorates the surface of that virus. And so all we're doing is we're basically taking the messenger RNA and plugging in the instructions for the spike protein. So our cells see that messenger RNA and they say, aha, here's a piece of our mRNA that's telling us to make this protein. And they make it just like they make all of our other proteins, and that protein gets presented on the surface of our cells. And so that messenger RNA, once it's done its job, it's degraded rapidly in the body. It's broken down and it's gone. It doesn't hang around. And so messenger RNA is actually highly unstable. It's degraded very easily. And so to get it into the body and to get it into our host cells, engineers and scientists figured out that they have to coat it in these lipid nanoparticles. Now that's a really fancy term, but all you really need to know is that these are little bitty tiny fat bubbles. And those fat bubbles help protect the mRNA, and those are what are injected into our arm, and those are delivering the messenger RNA into our host cells. And so again, that our host cells can then make that protein gets presented on the surface of our cell where our immune system, like antibodies, can recognize it and mount an immune response to it. And that way, if we're ever injected or infected, with the real virus, we already have pre-existing antibodies or other immune cells like T cells that can then react very quickly to the virus to protect us. So it's a very straightforward technology. It's what we call a plug and play, as opposed to one drug for one bug. These technologies are really cool because the messenger RNA can encode any protein from any virus. So that's why we call it plug and play. And they were designed for this exact purpose, to combat a pandemic, to combat an emerging virus that we didn't know how to grow and make lots of it. And this was based on advances that have been in development for more than 30 years. I can promise you this did not work like magic, in a month. This has been in development for 30 years. It's been tested and improved upon so that it would be ready to respond to a pandemic like COVID-19. So just to tell you guys a little bit about the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, I'm sure you guys are already familiar with this. Again, they're both very, very similar. They both use the messenger RNA platform. They both use these little lipid nanoparticles or fat bubbles to deliver the mRNA to our cells. The difference is that Moderna is a 2-dose schedule, and the second dose is given 4 weeks later. The Pfizer is the second dose is given 3 weeks later. In terms of their efficacy, in terms of their ability to reduce symptomatic disease, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. In terms of what we mean by symptomatic disease, they're both very, very good. So 94 to 95% efficacy for these mRNA platforms in terms of preventing mild to moderate COVID. It's even better for severe disease and hospitalization and death. And I'll get to that in a second. So what are the other types of vaccines that are out there that you guys are going to hear about hopefully soon? So the Johnson & Johnson platform, as well as the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines, are based on what are known as an adenovirus vector vaccine. These are also plug and play because in this instance, we have a virus. It's known as an adenovirus. All it does is cause a common cold. AstraZeneca uses one derived from chimpanzees that causes common colds in chimpanzees. Johnson & Johnson uses a modified human adenovirus that just causes the common cold in us, typically when we were kids. And so this adenovirus carries the gene, and that gene encodes the information for making the spike protein. So very similar to the messenger RNA, this is delivering the gene to make the spike protein. And as you can imagine with the mRNA, these adenoviruses, you could plug and play any virus protein of interest into these viral vectors as well. And they work very similarly. The virus will deliver the gene of interest to our cells. The cells will read that gene, and that gene eventually gets made into protein. And that protein is put on the cell surface so that we can mount an immune response to it. So the great news about these adenovirus vaccines is, like the mRNA technology, they target the spike protein too. And we know that that's been very successful, and that it's inducing a great immune response, and it's giving us great protection against COVID. So we're very hopeful that these adenovirus vaccines are going to do a great job too. So let me tell you a little bit about those. The one you've probably heard the most about is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. As I mentioned, it's based on a chimp adenovirus vector that delivers the gene for the spike protein to our cells. It's also a 2-dose vaccine. It's given anywhere between 3 and 12 weeks apart. So recent data out of the UK suggests that waiting 12 weeks for the second dose for this vaccine is better. And so they're seeing 76% efficacy after the first dose, and 82%, so a slight bump up in efficacy if you wait 12 weeks for that second dose. But the really encouraging news out of the UK is that this vaccine that's being widely distributed to people there, they've been swabbing the noses of individuals and following them after that first dose of vaccine. And when they look again at 12 weeks later, they're finding that people who have received the vaccine don't have any evidence of virus in their noses, and they're monitoring these people weekly. So this is really exciting, because what it means is that this vaccine may actually be blocking infection, so colonization with the virus, which would then prevent transmission of the virus. And we're seeing a reduction in about 67% of vaccinated individuals. That's very exciting, because if they're not colonized with the virus in their nasal cavity, they can't transmit the virus to someone who's not vaccinated yet. And because the efficacy for this vaccine is lower than the mRNA vaccines, we're hopeful that the mRNA vaccines are going to be able to reduce infection and transmission as well. And we're still waiting on that data. The one you're going to hear about real soon, I hope, is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because they just asked the US FDA for approval, or for emergency use authorization, based on the results of their phase 3 clinical trial. And it's 1 dose. And they're reporting an overall efficacy of 66%. So that was worldwide, where they conducted their phase 3 clinical trials. But there was an efficacy rate of 72% here in the United States. And so some of you may be thinking, well, I don't know about these, adenovirus vaccines. If I'm offered the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I might like to hold off and wait and get the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, because, Dr. Marisi just told me that's 94, 95% efficacy versus 72% efficacy. I'm going to hold off for the other one. So here's what I want to sort of explain about the vaccines. When we're talking about efficacy, what are they actually reporting? So you guys can imagine, if you're exposed to the virus, there are many different outcomes to that, right? You could get exposed, and you might not get colonized with the virus at all, and you might get no infection whatsoever. Or you might get colonized with the virus, and we call that, if the virus is able to establish colonization and you do have an infection with the virus, but it may be asymptomatic. And so we're hearing a lot about that hopefully in our children, thank goodness, and in our adolescents and teens. They seem to get a lot of asymptomatic infection. So they're carrying the virus, they may be transmitting the virus, but they're not getting sick. And then there's the rest of us who are likely to get, adults, we're likely to get symptomatic infection. And that can manifest in many different ways. So you could have very mild to moderate disease, or you could progress to very severe disease and hospitalization, and you could even die. And so when I'm telling you these efficacy rates that are being reported from these phase 3 clinical trials, that the media is, is picking up and advertising. What they're talking about is this mild to moderate disease right here. This is what those efficacy rates are measuring. So Moderna and Pfizer are 94 to, they're causing a 94 to 95% reduction in mild to moderate disease in vaccinated individuals compared to folks that weren't vaccinated in their clinical trials. And then again, the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson are somewhere in the 70% range. But what I really want you guys to appreciate is that every single one of these vaccines is doing a terrific job at preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And it's for this reason that I would encourage you to get the first vaccine that's made available to you, no matter what it is, because they're all going to save your life. They're all going to prevent you from going into the hospital. They're really good at that. And they're going to help us get the herd immunity. So let me tell you guys a little bit about some of the myths and misinformation that's being spread on social media and Facebook. And I was really happy to see that Facebook just came out with a statement that they are going to block and remove any misinformation. So any misinformation that's posted about not just COVID vaccines, but vaccines in general, if it's scientifically untrue and the data supports that is not the case, they are going to remove it. So I was thrilled to see that. But I'm sure you guys have heard a lot of these. So first of all, let me just say that the vaccines, even though these are nucleic acid-based vaccines, messenger RNA, for example, they're not going to integrate into your DNA. As I mentioned to you, messenger RNA is highly unstable. The proof in that, even if you don't believe the biology of messenger RNA being highly unstable, I'm sure you guys have all heard about Pfizer needing these ultra cold storage facilities and ultra cold freezers to store the vaccine. That's why, because the messenger RNA, if you leave it at room temperature, it breaks down, it gets degraded. And so again, they're fantastic vaccines. They're easily broken down. That's why they have to be kept in the freezer. And they're not going to integrate in your DNA. They're not going to hang around in your body. And as a matter of fact, the messenger RNA can't even reach the compartment in our cells, the nucleus, where our DNA is housed. Same thing with these adenoviruses. These are modified genetically so that they cannot replicate in your body. So they can't cause disease. Once the protein is made, they're broken down. They're not going to hang around. In terms of female health, there's been a lot of misinformation about these vaccines that they're going to cause female infertility. Completely false. There's no scientific evidence for that statement. I actually did some reading into that statement to see how it was derived. And basically they're trying to suggest that there's 4 little tiny pieces of the protein between the female placenta that match the SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus spike protein. And so they're saying, oh, well, if you get the vaccine, that targets the spike protein, it's going to target the female placenta, and you're going to get autoimmunity, and you're not going to be able to get, you're not going to be able to conceive. Again, completely false, no scientific basis for that. In fact, there were multiple women in the Pfizer vaccine trial who received the vaccine and became pregnant. And again, if there was any truth to that statement, we would see a lot of infertility in women getting infected with the virus, because the virus harbors the spike protein as well, and that's just not the case. We do know that the virus causes complications, and pregnant women are more likely to suffer complications for viral infections. So it's important, that women protect themselves with the vaccine. Okay, so the other point I'd like to make is the vaccines do not cause COVID-19. They absolutely cannot. I hope I've convinced you that from sharing with you how these platforms are made. They simply carry a piece and instructions to make a piece of the virus. There's no way it can cause the disease itself. It's not the intact virus. It's not live virus. The vaccines do not carry microchips to track you. That's another one that's been going around. Microchips are actually 1,000 times bigger than those tiny, tiny, tiny nanoparticles, and the adenovirus itself is a nanoparticle. So these microchips simply would not fit in vaccines. Completely untrue. This is probably the last statement here is probably the one that I can appreciate the most for people. And it's the thought that these vaccines, were rushed. And so what I'd like to try to do here is explain to you why these vaccines were not rushed and how they were expedited without cutting safety corners. So this is the traditional, up here at the top, is the traditional paradigm for producing a vaccine. And on average, it takes vaccines typically about 10 years from the beginning to the end for them to get approved for human use. And why is that? Well, most of the time it's because there's not a great sense of urgency. And so you're trying to develop a vaccine for a disease that, it would be great to have a vaccine against, and it would save a lot of mortality. But it's not a global crisis. And so people are developing vaccines, and once they finally have something that looks good in animal models, they'll share that data with the FDA, and they'll ask for approval to conduct clinical trials. And those clinical trials start off as phase, what we typically think of as phase 1, that progresses to phase 2, and eventually phase 3. And so these trials can typically take years to complete. And that's because of a number of reasons. First of all, they're very expensive. And so there's a huge financial investment on the part of the pharmaceutical company. And there's also, a huge financial risk, because there's no guarantee that these vaccines are going to work for most vaccines. In fact, most vaccines fail. And so they do this slowly. And so in phase 1, they recruit, maybe less than 100 individuals or a couple of hundred individuals, and then they'll move to phase 2 where they'll expand that to a few thousand, and then many years later they'll move to phase 3 if the phase 1 and phase 2 look good, and they'll enroll tens of thousands of people. And so what happened so these wait for each other to occur, right? So they take many years to occur, and then if they do get the green light, if they do look good, then they start manufacturing on a large scale, because they're not going to start doing this if they're not going to get approval. So if we look at what happened in this circumstance, we knew that we needed, vaccines, and we needed them quickly. So as I mentioned, these platforms have been in development for decades. They weren't really new. And so we already had a tremendous knowledge in animals. We also actually had some phase 1 data already, because some of these platforms were in use for other diseases like Zika virus, Ebola virus, and HIV/AIDS. And so we already had safety data on many of these platforms. And so what we did is we initiated phase 1 trials. And then once we had enough safety data in this phase 1 cohort, we began phase 2 without waiting for phase 1 to complete. But again, we waited until we had enough safety data and enough people enrolled that we could follow in phase 1 before we initiated phase 2. And then the same thing for phase 3. So the phases were overlapped. And so what we were able to do is, again, all of the participants in these phases are being followed very carefully for safety and efficacy of the vaccines. But instead of waiting for one to finish completely, so again, these phase 1 individuals, you don't follow them for 2 months and stop. You follow them for 2 years. But we didn't want to wait 2 years to get a vaccine for COVID-19. So what we did is we started phase 2, and then once we had enough data in phase 2 to warrant phase 3, we started phase 3. And so we were able to condense the time from years to basically 4 months for the Moderna messenger RNA vaccine. The initiation from phase 1 to phase 3 occurred in a 4-month period. And there were 2 other reasons we were able to do that. One, again, the vaccines had to prove that they were safe and looked like they would work in these individuals. But we had lots and lots of volunteers. So you can imagine if there's a new vaccine in development for some disease you've never heard of, it's really hard to recruit volunteers for these clinical trials. But we had an amazing turnout of willing participants, people who wanted to contribute, who wanted to get involved. And so it was very easy to recruit people to these phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. And in phase 3, we're talking about tens of thousands of people. And so that was great. People volunteered. We were able to enroll people very quickly. And so that also diminished the delay. And lastly, it was that, the biggest thing, I think it always comes down to money, the financial risk. And it was mitigated by the federal government and other agencies that helped offset the risks and the costs. And the federal government donated more than $26 billion to these companies to help finance these vaccines. And that's the real reason that they were able to go so quickly. So they were able to initiate manufacturing well before the end of the phase 3 clinical trial. Let's see. So if we look at Pfizer's trial, there were 43,000 volunteers in the phase 3 clinical trial across 6 countries and 16 US states. In Moderna's trial, they had 30,000 volunteers in 30 US states. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is the one I think the United States will implement hopefully in the next week or two, they had already tested that viral vector, that adenovirus vector that they use for other diseases in other parts of the world in hundreds of thousands of individuals. So we already had a really good idea of its safety and immunogenicity. And the results from these clinical trials told us that it was safe and efficacious across all genders, all ages, all different ethnic and racial groups, and people with pre-existing medical conditions that were also enrolled in these studies. So again, these vaccines, as far as vaccines go, are some of the safest that have ever been developed. And I can promise you that before authorization, these vaccines were incredibly scrutinized. So we hear a lot about the FDA that will carefully review the safety data from these clinical trials. One example that these vaccines aren't being rushed is, Johnson & Johnson released their phase 3 data and requested emergency use authorization more than a week ago. And we're still waiting, right? We're still waiting for the FDA to issue that. That's because they are taking their time carefully reviewing all of the safety data from those trials. And they're also waiting on the recommendations of an advisory committee on immunization practices, which is an independent group of experts that have no connection to these trials or these pharmaceutical companies. They are vaccine experts, they're clinicians, they're scientists, and they're looking at the data as well. And they're going to make a recommendation to the FDA. And so we're waiting on those folks to tell us, if they feel these vaccines are safe and effective. And then once the vaccines are given emergency use authorization, there are numerous mechanisms in place to follow the safety and efficacy of these vaccines in not only the volunteers in the clinical trials who are still being closely monitored, but also in people like us who are getting the vaccines. So the FDA and the CDC are monitoring safety and side effects. And there are all sorts of now great apps and websites where any one of us can go on and report an adverse event. And so, millions of people have already responded to the CDC who have received the mRNA vaccines. And, the side effects are mostly mild. So, what are the side effects? Again, I want to reassure you that these nucleic acid-based vaccines, they don't remain in our body. The side effects that we're seeing are mostly mild or moderate. So people are getting headaches, maybe some fatigue, definitely pain at the injection site. And then some people are developing chills and fever, particularly after the second dose of the mRNA vaccines. Probably the biggest adverse event that we're seeing from the mRNA vaccines are these allergic reactions that we're hearing about, which are typically between 2 and 6 cases per 1 million doses that are given. So the Moderna's is about 2 per million, Pfizer's is about 6 per million doses. And it's thought that the allergic reaction is due to the polyethylene glycol that's in those little fat bubbles that I talked to you about, the little lipid nanoparticles. And polyethylene glycol has been considered biologically safe for a very long time. And it's used in a lot of things. And it's thought that the human population some people have developed allergies to polyethylene glycol due to its common use. And so, all of these allergic reactions that we're seeing, again, very rare and all treatable. So again, most of these vaccine side effects are very moderate, mild. I'd like to also point out, there's vaccines I think get a bad rap, and people are very fearful of them because of the misinformation. They're sort of the sharks of the ocean, right? And so, but please remember, it's so much safer to get the vaccine than the risk getting COVID, right? We have thousands of people dying of COVID daily, and your chance of dying with COVID is it's really, if you're in those high risk groups, it's high. And so we know that there are other effects as well. So 1 in 10 people have these prolonged illnesses. Many have 4-month-long battles of symptoms. We're seeing neurological issues. We're seeing chronic fatigue syndrome. And we're even seeing that people who had asymptomatic infections, so they didn't even know that they had the virus, but they test positive. When we're looking at their readouts of health of their heart and their lung, we're seeing abnormalities. So this is a very frightening virus. I think we're going to see consequences of this virus in individuals manifesting later in life. And so any unknown fear of getting a vaccine, you just have to, sort of balance that with the extreme risk and likelihood of disease from this virus. So do we really need a vaccine? So let me just throw some math out to you. This is sort of, very simple math. If we estimate, that 20% of Americans are immune, it might be a little higher in some cities, some parts of the country, but if we estimate on average that 20% of Americans are immune, meaning they have some sort of natural immunity to the virus from either asymptomatic or symptomatic infection. And if we say that we need about 80% of the population to be immune, to help us get to herd immunity, and I know you guys as being in the agricultural business are very familiar with herd immunity because it certainly affects our animals and crops too. And it just simply means that we need enough of individuals to have immunity to the virus that we can sort of block and limit the transmission of the virus so that people who aren't immune are protected. So if we just say that we need 80% of the population to achieve herd immunity, then and 20% are already immune, so we need 60% more Americans to become immune to get there. So 60% of 330 million Americans is about 198 million Americans that are still not protected. So if those 198 million Americans don't get vaccinated, and we're looking at a 1 to 2% death rate with this virus, then we're looking at 2 to 4 million more Americans dying. And I don't know about you guys, but that's, to me, is just heartbreaking. And so these vaccines, if we implement these, and I think we're going to see a huge, increase in vaccination over the next couple of weeks, we could really save lives. And so I would really encourage you guys to get vaccinated, encourage your loved ones to get vaccinated. So you guys have probably heard a lot about the variants in the news. And so what are viral variants? Viruses mutate. That's what they do. That's how they evolve. This isn't really surprising to us that they're doing this. They're doing it much more quickly than we had expected. And that's because worldwide, we've done a pretty lousy job of containing this virus. And so the one that you guys have probably heard a lot about is this virus that was first detected in England. It's known as B117. And it's here in the United States, and it's probably going to become the dominant viral variant in a few months. And so what we mean by that is it's mutated in a way that spike protein that is encoded in our vaccines is now different on the virus itself. It's mutated a couple of regions in its spike protein that's allowing it to sort of try to escape our immune response. And so we know that this virus is more highly transmissible than the original virus. And so that's an important point that we all still need to keep wearing masks. It's not more deadly, but if it's more transmissible, it's going to infect more people and it's going to cause more hospitalizations and deaths. But the mutation itself is not making it more deadly. Fortunately, it has low immune escape, and most of the vaccines do a very good job of still protecting against this variant. The one that's emerged in South Africa is known as B1351. It is also in the United States now. It has high immune escape, meaning it's mutated its spike protein in such a way that it's able to escape some of the immune responses that were either promoted from natural infection with the virus or that the vaccines are inducing. And so we already have these plug and play vaccines being modified to protect against this variant. And so this is really important. We know that Pfizer's vaccine still does a very good job against this variant. I think Moderna's is going to do a very good job as well. And when you're seeing reports in the news that the vaccines don't work as well against these variants, again, what they're talking about is that mild to moderate disease. These vaccines are still providing very good protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and death, even against these variants. And that's why it's really important that we all get vaccinated as quickly as possible so that we can stop this virus from spreading and mutating even further. And then I'd like to end with some common questions about the COVID vaccines that many of you may have, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So the first is, should pregnant women get the vaccine? And as you know, pregnant women are more likely to experience severe disease from many infections, and the fetus is also susceptible to many infections. And so the CDC has issued that pregnant women should be offered the vaccine. And I know for many women that's a very personal decision, and so I would encourage you to speak with your healthcare provider and talk to them if you have any concerns. But again, keep in mind that the risk of infection with the virus is very dangerous. And as I hope I've explained to you, these vaccines, in particularly the mRNA vaccines, they don't contain any live virus, and so they're very safe. And pregnant women, it's not thought that pregnant women would have any increased risk to those vaccines. Should immune suppressed individuals get the vaccines? So immune suppressed covers a very large, population of individuals with very different immune circumstances. And so again, you are more likely probably to suffer from severe infection with the virus and perhaps get hospitalized or die if you're immune suppressed. And so you also should consider getting the vaccine. You should talk with your healthcare provider as well as the doctor or nurse who's administering the vaccine to you about your underlying condition and about the medications that you're on. There is a checklist, when you consent to being vaccinated, that will ask you specific questions about your medications, and they can counsel you at that time about the vaccine. Can children get the vaccine? So Pfizer vaccine is approved for individuals 16 years and older. Moderna's is approved for 18 years and older. So as of now, anyone under those age groups cannot get the vaccine. The trials are underway. So Moderna has trials, Pfizer has trials. They're underway for children. They're looking at 12 to 16, 7 to 12, I think some even 6 to 12. So they're doing sort of what's known as a dose escalation, where they lower the amount of vaccine that's given, and they're testing to see if it's safe and effective in kids. And I've heard Dr. Fauci from the NIH speak and say that we think, or we're hopeful that perhaps vaccines will be available for first graders by the fall for the next school year. But those clinical trials are underway now. If someone had COVID, should they still get the vaccine? So the answer to this is yes. We don't know how long protection against COVID lasts. It's thought that probably about 3 months, you're still safe. If you recovered from COVID, about 3 months later, you're definitely probably still safe from reinfection. But these new variants are emerging, as I mentioned, so that's going to throw a curveball to us. And so the recommendation is yes, you absolutely should still get the vaccine. The CDC is indicating if you've been treated with convalescent plasma or monoclonal antibodies as part of a COVID treatment, that you should wait 90 days before you get the vaccine. And that's because if any of that is still remaining in your system, it could actually blunt the effects of the vaccine, and the vaccine wouldn't do any good. But if you have any concerns or questions, talk to your healthcare provider. And then, do I still have to wear a mask after getting the vaccine? So, unfortunately, we do. We still have to wear masks, and that's because it's going to take some time, for everyone to get vaccinated. You're not protected after right away after the vaccine. So, that first dose of vaccine is going to provide a lot of protection, but it's that second dose that's you really need to get for the mRNA vaccines to get that efficacy rate really high. And it's usually 1 to 2 weeks after that second dose that you're considered protected. And then keep in mind, that there are, like I mentioned, folks under the age of 16 who can still spread the virus. And they, they do, although the illness is milder in those individuals, we want to protect them as well. And so we want to continue wearing masks until we can get to the point where we've sort of blocked the transmission of virus in our community and the risk is so low of viral infection that, we can return to normal as a society. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any individual